I'm grateful to be with you this morning. When Pastor Jenny called me about 2 years ago with the vision that your church shared for transforming into a vibrant and a vital future, I was thrilled at the opportunity for my 3 kids, Jude, somewhere, and Lucy and Sadie, to come and join you. And since then, my fiancée Jeanette has come along on the journey as well. Though we won't be able to go to the worship in the wilderness that Hank is organizing because we're getting married that weekend. So have fun without us. We'll come next year. We've been thrilled to be a part of a church that does justice and loves mercy and walks humbly, and the church that shares radically the inclusive love of God for every person, no exceptions. So thank you for the opportunity to be your contemporary music minister and for playing with this band. And thank you also for the opportunity to share my heart from this gospel text this morning. So what happens on a road trip? At least for me, it's either like open windows and real talk, or it's closed minds and arguments. Now, I am throwing my kids under the bus right now, but I'm assuming that I'm not alone. Has anybody ever experienced that? Like, hey, kids, it's time to go, and then they're fine, and then when they get in the car, it's a war zone. They get out of the car, they're fine, because there's, Slurpees at the gas station. But when they're in the car, it's a war zone. So this is what I've experienced on road trips. It's either open windows and open minds and real talk, or it's closed windows and arguments. And the road to Jerusalem is a long one. Today's gospel text is a road trip story. And in this story, we have both of these road trip possibilities happening. We have open windows and real talk, and we have closed minds and arguments. Jesus is sharing some really heavy stuff. He's sharing about the ultimate sacrifice of divine love. He's sharing about the way things are going to go for their crew in the not-too-distant future. He's sharing about the coming showdown between the oppressive militarized state and him and his group. He's sharing about the losses that they will experience. He's being open. He's being vulnerable. But on this road trip, the windows close for the disciples and their minds too. They don't get it. They're not curious, and they surely don't get why on this road trip with the windows down, Jesus wants to bring such a doom and gloom topic into the room. Their closed minds lead to fear and agitation, and so they begin to argue. It's a way that they're venting this tension that they have inside. They're getting stormy inside because of what Jesus is talking about on this road trip. So they begin to argue with each other. When all of a sudden, Jesus, driving the disciple minivan, turns around and says, "Kids, what are you arguing about?" By the way, I borrowed nothing from my own life experience in the preparation of this message. I've heard about it. "Kids, what are you arguing about?" Ain't nobody got time for that. What are you arguing about? They respond with silence. Awkward silence, like this one. And deafening silence. In the original language, the Greek word is siopeo. Say siopeo. Congratulations, you are now Greek scholars. Google plus that, you're good. Siopeo, silence doesn't mean I'm defiantly not going to answer your question. I'm shutting my mouth to show you that I think I'm boss of this conversation. That's not what this kind of silence means. This kind of silence is an inability to speak. It's involuntary. They are paralyzed and can't respond. They are paralyzed by fear. They are paralyzed by shame. Jesus is saying, "What are you arguing about?" Now, for the record, let's pull back from this one little episode and look wider at the Gospels for a moment. For the record, the male disciples of Jesus really struggle along the way. They rarely get it. They focus on the wrong things. and they disappear when the going gets tough. On the other hand, the female disciples of Jesus are a completely different story. Now, we don't see them in this particular episode, but where we do see them in other stories in the Gospels, the female disciples of Jesus are showing up. They're speaking out. They're sharing the good news with courage, and they're risking their own resources to do so. But here, we have a bunch of guys arguing about greatness, comparing the sizes of their influence, bank accounts, friends lists, crowds, committee appointments, investments, little black books. And Jesus says, "What are you arguing about?" Are they arguing about how to feed more people? How to welcome new people, especially ones that maybe think differently or look differently than the original crew? Are they arguing about how to grow their movement? Are they arguing about how to be a historic building with modern thinking? Are they arguing about how to be a beacon of hope in the heart of Jerusalem? Or how to be a bold witness to love in a culture increasingly fractured by fear and bigotry? Are they arguing about how to be a prophetic voice for justice and compassion? No, they're not arguing about any of these things. They're arguing about who is the greatest, the best, the first, the one entitled to deference and benefit. So Jesus sits down. In other words, on this bumpy road trip to Jerusalem, the one with the open windows and the closed minds, Jesus pulls the car over. Now, we know something important is coming when Jesus sits down. This is the traditional posture of a Jewish teacher in the ancient world. This isn't just a casual conversation, but this is something critical now. This is something profound, something meaningful and memorable. When Jesus sits down, it's time to listen up. But don't just listen to his words. Watch his actions also. As he so often does, Jesus uses more than words to teach his lessons. He likes earthy stuff. He likes earthy illustrations. He uses things like mustard seeds, lamps on stands, bread, water, wine, even dogs eating crumbs under a table, like Pastor Jenny shared with us recently. Jesus also teaches through his encounters with human beings, touching them in order to heal them, feeding them when they are hungry, speaking the good news that will liberate them from everything that shackles and shames them. Jesus sits down, so it's time to listen up. And what does he do when he sits down? He brings a child to the center of the conversation. But it's not that simple. In our culture, we put children first, or think we do, or say we do, or try to, some combination of that. In our culture, that's what we do. In our culture, we try to insulate children from danger, or we try to. In our culture, we cultivate children with no end of academic and extracurricular opportunities, and we make ourselves crazy doing it. But in first century Palestine, it was completely different than that. It was not women and children first. Far from it. Even Thomas Aquinas, if you've heard of him, he's a great saint and church leader of the 13th century that influenced actually so much of what has become modern American Christianity. Even St. Thomas Aquinas said this: "In a raging fire, a husband is obligated to save his father first, and then his mother, and then his wife, and then his child." See, children in first century Palestine didn't matter, didn't count. They were insignificant, powerless, subject, needy, socially invisible, ignored, dominated, little esteemed, non-productive, helpless, dependent, a burden. In a word, children were vulnerable. Here the disciples are arguing about greatness, but Jesus makes his counter-argument about the ways of God as clear as possible when he takes a child in his arms. While the distracted and the divided male disciples of Jesus are arguing about greatness, Jesus flips the script, subverts their priorities, makes an object lesson of snot-nosed, selfish, hard-to-love half-pints. That's some pretty sophisticated biblical investigation I did to figure out that child was indeed A snot-nosed, selfish, hard-to-love half-pint? Am I wrong? But don't misunderstand the purpose. This tender scene with the toddler isn't a sentimental moment. This isn't subject matter for Norman Rockwell or Thomas Kincaid. This isn't cutesy bumper sticker fodder. Instead, this is a countercultural, status quo smashing, provocative demonstration of what it really, really means to say that God's love is for everyone and to say that all are welcome. Say that with me. All are welcome. Reverend Barbara Brown Taylor, Episcopal priest and theologian and one of the most influential people, according to Time magazine, says this: Jesus didn't just tell them, but showed them who was the greatest. Sorry, Muhammad Ali. But according to Reverend Taylor, the greatest is 26 inches tall, limited vocabulary, unemployed, zero net worth, nobody. In other words, God's agent. By the way, this isn't just a feel-good sermon for those who might not be kid people. So if that's you and you're like, man, I love this. I love where this is going. That's not exactly what it's all about. The list is long of other people who don't count besides just kids in this context. Other people don't count are poor folk. Poor folk don't count. Farmers don't count. Widows don't count. Slaves don't count. The unemployed don't count. Prisoners don't count. Refugees don't count. Immigrants don't count. The homeless don't count. And kids don't count. But Jesus took a child in his arms. And when he did, he shouted from the rooftops that all are welcome. Say it with me. All are welcome. Now, while we might think that things have dramatically improved since those long ago days when children were devalued, we are hard-pressed to defend the suffering of the children today whose lives and well-being have not been put at the top of our communal priority list. Now, in our families, we may love and cherish our children, or say we do, or try to. But what can we say about the children who live in the food deserts and underserved neighborhoods in our own Opportunity City? What can we say about the children who live in the small towns and rural areas where kids don't have access to health care or basic services, and where the opiate epidemic is sending mothers who need treatment? They're sending these mothers actually to prison and manufacturing a generation of orphans in the process. What can we say about those kids? What can we say about children who live in war-torn nations or parts of the world where climate change is threatening the subsistence farming that everyone depends on? What can we say about those kids? But Jesus took this child in his arms. Took this child in his arms. Into his arms, Jesus takes children at the border. Jesus takes Carolinians whose poverty prevented them from evacuation and whose landlords are going to take their time on repairing the flood damage. Jesus takes into his arms the trans young adult whose mom just kicked them out of the house. Jesus takes into his arms the person addicted to opiates. Jesus takes into his arms the person who's shooting up around the corner from this church right this minute, and the person who loves that person. Jesus takes into his arms Lou. Lou, are you still in the room? Lou's been sleeping on the back porch for 3 years, and he gets his apartment this week. Right, Pastor Jenny? Jesus takes into his arms teenage Christine Blasey Ford. Jesus takes into his arms the person who shouted aggressive obscenities at me last Sunday at the coffee bar when I simply said to her, "Ma'am, the pastor has asked us to whisper." Jesus takes me and you into his arms. Jesus took this child into his arms, embraced this child. Now, the ancient word used to describe this moment in the original language talks about taking another into the curves of their arm. Can everybody do that with me? Can you humor me? Make your arms in a curve. Look at that shape. Look at these curves. That's what this word is about. taking another person into the curves of your arm, and fitting to the misbehaving male disciples who set up this moment with their greatness grapple, that's a feminine noun in the original language, just for the record. Jesus embraces this child with nurture, with care, with a life-giving hug. So Psychology Today tells us that while many studies have repeatedly indicated that 3 seconds is the average length of time that people are engaged in a hug, will you do something for me? Will you love yourself? Will you hug yourself? 1,001, 1,002, 1,003. Okay, thank you. The average length. Researchers at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill have also shown that when hugs last 20 seconds, something different occurs altogether. Will you hug yourself again? When a hug lasts 20 seconds, something different happens. The oxytocin hormone, the same hormone that's present when bonding with a baby or when making love, the same oxytocin hormone is produced. Oxytocin offers a calming effect on the body and the mind. An increase in the hormone can have benefits on our overall health. It can support, among many other things, our sense of safety, decreasing anxiety, increasing relaxation, increasing a sense of calm. Jesus took this child in his arms, and he increased the safety of that child and decreased the anxiety. He increased the connection and decreased the shame. Now, Brené Brown, researcher, storyteller, TED Talk sensation, and an author of a book that literally changed my life called Daring Greatly, Brené Brown has been exploring this topic of connection and shame in her work for more than a decade and a half. She found that people that experience love and belonging have a few things in common, and she set out to figure out what those things are. People who experience love and belonging have the courage to be imperfect. People who experience love and belonging have the compassion to be kind to themselves first and then to others. People who experience love and belonging have the ability to connect as a result of authenticity. And by that I mean they're willing to let go of who they thought they should be in order to be who they really, really, really are. And finally, Brené Brown found that people who experience love and belonging embrace vulnerability. They believe that what makes them vulnerable also makes them human, and by that I mean makes them beautiful and beloved. So what is this vulnerability that we're talking about? Vulnerability is saying I love you first. Vulnerability is doing something when there are no guarantees. Vulnerability is approaching change with courage and patience. Vulnerability is saying no. Vulnerability is saying yes. Vulnerability is breathing through waiting for the doctor to call with the test results. Vulnerability is getting laid off. Vulnerability is deciding who gets laid off. Vulnerability is investing in relationships even when relationships hurt. Vulnerability is leaving a dangerous relationship. Vulnerability is losing your faith. Vulnerability is finding your faith again. Vulnerability is open windows and open minds. So Brené Brown found in her research that true courage is vulnerability. True wholeheartedness is vulnerability. True greatness. Now listen up, disciples arguing about greatness that started this whole thing in the beginning. True greatness is vulnerability. So when Jesus takes a child in his arms, he is literally embracing vulnerability. When Jesus takes a child in his arms, he is powerfully, provocatively, and prophetically embracing vulnerability. The road to Jerusalem is long. and bumpy and windy and travels over troubled waters. But there are lessons along the way, because sometimes we need to pull the car over and sit down for some real talk. So today, Jesus teaches us on the road to Jerusalem to embrace vulnerability, to discard notions of greatness, and to realize that we experience the most meaningful connections in life when all are welcome into God's loving community. Please say, all are welcome, because Jesus took this child in his arms. Let's pray. Loving God, we thank you for embracing our imperfections and embracing our vulnerability. God, we thank you for filling our lungs and our lives with your love. In Jesus' name, amen.